Thank you. I should have displayed some technology. It would have gotten a bigger crowd, I think. But anyway, I'm looking at the most important piece of hardware, software, and that's behind the eyeballs. And so when I talk about the language of VR, I'm really talking about the language of experience in the imagination. And what's important about language in the experience imagination is so that we can share our thoughts and ideas, our dreams with each other. And so language is really the bridge to be able to look at human connection and social engagement. And that's the area that we need to get to. That is where we devise our language. We invent language to do that. And most people don't realize that language is a technology. It's an ancient disruptive technology, but it's a technology we invented. We weren't born with that. But it become part of our world, so much so it's like eating and breathing. But the reality is that when we lose the language, like with aphasia, aphasia is when you have a stroke and you lose your language and the ability to talk, that is where we really start to understand the value of language and where we need to work on with language with VR. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about in my talk. Now, I've been doing, for 25 years, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, all the forms of realities for all forms of education, training, entertainment, communication, everything you can. Because what I wanted to do is the common denominator between all these experiences, no matter what technology you use, even with reality, is a human being. That is the constant. That is how we work. That's how we interface. And as much attention as we're looking at external stimuli, it's really what's inside that is how we work. And how do we work? And how does that language work with us? And how do we invent the language that we've grown up with, which evolved thousands of years and transformed our human species from a very insignificant species that's no more important than butterflies, less important than bees and ants, to a world-dominating species. It's with language. And with language, it's our ability to share our imagination. And that's the key. And so that's where we need to really understand where is VR in the language of VR. So no better way to look at language as when you lose language. So the guy on the left is a aphasia client, and he is trying to express his ideas. But without, what happens with aphasia is that the pathways between your working memory and your memory of your language is all scrambled up. So we can't find the words. The language is in there, he can't see it. Whether it's reading, writing, speaking, or hearing, the language is there. So you're literally trapped in your head. And there's other talks I've gotten in AR to look at that, and it's very powerful. But what we're doing is that we're now working with the space industry, because what happens with a loss of language is a loss of connection and social engagement, which leads to isolation, which leads to poor performance and experience. And the same thing is happening and will happen with astronauts in deep space. So we're working with the space industry to see what we've been doing in advancements of aphasia to space, deep space exploration, so that we don't lose that human connection and that social engagement. But first, let me look at and explain a background of virtual reality. Some of you might have just experienced virtual reality. Some have been in there for up to 50 years, like my collaborator, Tom Furness. But let's just run over real quickly. We have reality, we have virtual reality, which is very much what Plato and Aristotle talked and said was mimesis. It's a replication of reality, but not quite. It's usually like a work of art. It represents reality, but it's not quite. Now, Aristotle and Plato basically said the reality and mimesis, or the virtual reality, were two separate things never to be combined. But what we have the power of now is what we call the virtuality continuum that puts real things in virtual spaces, which is augmented virtuality, and virtual things in real spaces, which is augmented reality. So many of you probably know that, but we have to look at the continuum because it's real important. Because what is really important is not necessarily the external stimuli, but it is the internal models that we make. And it's in our imagination that we're putting these pieces together. We get one image from one eye and one image to the other eye. We don't put that together to tell it it's behind the eyeballs. Okay? That's a very simplistic model that we create. But we are creating and adding to our memories and our dreams and our creativity. That creates a very sophisticated kind of working area. That is our consciousness in basic. And within our consciousness and our human connection, we really have to understand how we're simulating identities, because it's not as much as where you are, but who you are. And when you have that human going into a virtual world, become an avatar, when you have identities in the virtual space unconnected with humans, you have the agent, which then when they transfer back to reality, they become autonomous vehicles or things that are robotics. And all of these are a continuum also, because the who is much as where the where and the what. And that leads to that human connection, is that's what we need to measure and explore. But let's look at, with the language, we have to look at what happened before language happened. We still connected with human beings. We still had social engagements by using gestures, sounds, pictures, and symbols, and that's what constructed the invention of language. But the thing is that language, human connection happened before language. How do we do that? The constructs of how we play together, and other species play also, to learn, to interact. We look at story to understand different aspects of meaning with the games and that building of engagement, but also simple as music and dance is very intuitive. Those are languages, if you will, before our construct of a very precise language of literature or so forth. And so when we advance that language into other forms of speech and writing,
has been reported in this building. Please cease.
are we supposed to leave? Language, are we turned off? All right. With that language, the form of efficient language, we go into different levels of broadcast. So the media and maturation of the media really becomes much more aware and connected to the rest of the world. But individually, we can become disconnected and also isolated. And this is what happens a lot with social media. And that's one of the things that we really have to understand, what we learn and what we transfer from the traditional media to the media and language of VR. And so when we look at the movie Matrix, we had to choose between real and virtual. That is a misunderstood construct. We don't need that, and that's a continuum. But remember, in the movie, they had another thing. It's that reality that rules all these realities, which is the imagination, which is where consciousness is. And that's where we need to look at. It's not the external stimuli, but the internal. But I work in working with theme parks and movies and musicals and so forth, so I work with play, story, and game to really kind of take that external stimuli and build a model inside our imagination and communicate and connect. And so when you look at reality, virtuality, and imaginality, every form of literature, or whether it's literary, cinematic, game, or theme parks, it's using different parts of this. And like Ernest Hemingway, he says, the better the literature is the less you say and the more you spark the imagination of the reader. So he says the best story experience is I only write 1/8 of the story experience. The reader imagines 7/8. Now, as media has matured, we haven't increased that ratio. We need to kind of have the imagined world 8 times what the virtual is, and we haven't gotten that. And that's where we need to achieve if we're going to get to that metaverse where we have experience equaling virtuality times reality times imaginality to get to expanse of a level that is beyond comprehension at this point. And so when we maturate this media, we can't dumb down the audience and replace the imagination. We need to engage the imagination. And this is one of the areas that we've been working with is aphasia. This is an aphasia client. He has loss of words. Now, he's highly functional. He has some words, but he has hard to connect it. We couldn't create a virtual world because that relationship with that therapist is so critical in helping him. But also the reality around him, the clinic, we don't need the clinic. We need a story world that he can be immersed in, and he's telling a story with physical objects in front of him that creates a virtual world around him, and he's being lost in this virtual world. And what we discovered and what we saw is that the language started really flowing, and we didn't know why. It was a remarkable aspect on this pilot test. So the only way we looked at that is that we actually had to take away the virtuality and just look at a physical reality. We authored what we call story troves, which are artifacts that reveal a story. These are authored, like a short story, like Harry Potter, but these are artifacts that we look into, and they're meant to provoke in the imagination a story. And these people work with that, and this is an example, and you see they don't use many words. We don't have the audio. But anyway, they use one word, not in even sentences, but they're connecting, they're relating, and they're building a story world together through conversation. And that's that ability to work with conversation in that situation. They're building an entire virtual world, not just as a book, as a singular experience, but they're creating a whole imaginary story world together. They're getting lost in their imagination. Has anyone ever got lost in the book? Raise your hand. What would it feel like if you couldn't do that? Without aphasia, we can't get lost in the book. But what we discovered is this, working with objects, we were able to get them to lost in their imagination with story, like a short story, but without the barrier of words. And it was amazing. What was happening with that imagination, that physical embodied cognition, what is happening in that social interaction that is having such an important aspect? So now what we're doing is we're seeing that we're consistently being able.
Your attention, please. The alarm condition has been investigated and cleared by life safety personnel. You may return to normal operations. Thank you for your cooperation.
And so now we're bringing in the virtuality, and it's amazing how much it takes away, but there's some things that we can bring together, and we're really slicing it as we're doing the analysis of the voice and the inflection. We're working with brain imagery and so forth to really look at it, because we're working with the space industry. We have to understand, how are we doing this imagination? How is that social engagement inflecting our ability to communicate and connect? And this is what we're going to be able to look at. With virtual reality, in the language of virtual reality, we're going to be able to get to a level of human connection and social engagement that we have never been experienced before. And so you have to imagine before we had language, when we were trying to communicate and we were, species less important than the butterfly. This is very important, and we're just in the beginning of this area. But let me try to explain very clearly about what's happening. So we have an empathetic imagination and expressive imagination. We focus too much in Hollywood on the expressive imagination and don't allow the audience to use their empathetic imagination. And when you have that trove, spark stories in the imagination, they start thinking, their cognition, both working with their heads, but they take things out of the box and work with it. We call it body cognition, walking with it, working with it, thinking with our hands. And with another person, they're wondering, what are you thinking? And what are you coming at? And they have to express this, even though they don't have that command of words. But they use every broad form of communication with sounds and inflections and expressions, and really going back to where we started to work with before we had language, and we started to understand we have a huge amount of connection and engagement without the language. But it's important that we take turns on the expressive imagination of the storyteller and the empathetic imagination of the story listener that creates that story trance that we always love to experience in story. But now we're dealing with back and forth where it's a story conversation. And it's this point that overrides our limitations of words and language, which really makes that connection. And then we're thinking that as we add virtuality, so not to diminish that, but add to that, is a very great deal of potential. So this conversation, we're creating a story together. So to share and expand this story, we have that human connection because we're collaborating on that story to that one story. Even though we're influenced by all other different types of stories and experience and dreams and hopes, we're bringing it together to really kind of look at that story collaboration, which in the end becomes very memorable. And what we're doing here, quite intuitively, is working with story playing and game, particularly story participation, how the author and the audience work, but also the actor that gives agency. And you have different ways that we can borrow from different existing technology, where the author doesn't always have to author, or the actor acting, or the audience absorbing. You have the audience participating in authoring, not replacing it, with role-playing games. We have the actor participating in authoring by improv, but not replacing the author. And this participation is a whole language and exchange that is, we're dealing with 3 levels of reality, virtuality, and imaginality. The story provokes the imagination and taps the heart to really kind of answer the question of why do I care? The reality and the body cognition is really kind of engaging the physical aspect and kind of saying, what do I do and how did that reality? The reality has so much sense of presence and meaning to them. Very intuitively. And then the game mechanics is building and scaffolding that understanding and meaning, not only to yourself, but together, back and forth, the virtuality, the media, and that all works together in what we call the interplay of story, play, and game. And that answers, why should I care? What should I do? Why, how do I work with that? And that working with the head, hands, and heart, this is one of the things I found that I can engage people indefinitely, no matter what age, preschool to senior citizens. If I have their head, heart, and hands engaged, we have them. And with the story, we work with characters, worlds, and events, the cause, response, and consequence with play, and the head, the goals, rules, and tools. These are the constructs of these things that are make them very distinct, but interdependent. And we can't separate them, but we can't see them all the same thing to work together in this aspect of the interplay experiential learning strategy that we work with. And this has been applied to learning, to performance, in all these areas, and with the ability for perceptual computing, we're getting the data to relate with the subject matter experts, analogical reasoning, to really start to look at machine and human communication, to really start to reveal what that imagination not only does, but can do. And I leave you with this as far as the language of VR is the language of imagination. It goes not just from comprehension and creation, but also to collaboration. And one of the stories I had very young is that I was labeled as a slow reader, just because when I was reading, I couldn't read fast. But every word popped a world in my head. I wanted to read sentences twice, but I was labeled as a slow reader and discouraged from reading. But what I was doing is my overactive imagination was exploring these words, this window of words. And when I went to college, I realized my comprehension was so much more than anybody else, that I wasn't a slow reader, I was a luxurious reader. And that is the hidden magic in the imagination, is that we need to, and we're just starting, to develop and invent the language of VR, which is beyond the technology, beyond the software, to get that. And I please invite you to, on Friday, where we have a whole day of symposium on looking at the human impact of VR, AR, MR at the Virtual World Society speaker series, VR for Good. I have a panel with some of the people in the audience called the Gymnasium of the Imagination. Where do we go to exercise the imagination? We need more of those. Thank you very much.
If you want to go ahead and take a couple of questions,
yeah.
I think we should shift because of the fire alarm and everything, try and shift 5 minutes off on our schedule. Go ahead and take a couple minutes.
All right. Any questions?
So, do you think that there's going to be a challenge getting people to want to participate? There had been a whole line of thinking when there was talk about interactive movies, people having choice, that ultimately they didn't want to participate in the storytelling.
Yeah, that was a false negative. So basically, a movie is designed to be the theater is important as the movie. And so the movie has a limitation of audiovisual and your focal perception in 2D, okay? You have 3 dimensions, you have 360 degrees and 5 senses. We're used to using all senses, all dimensions, all realities, all directions. We're not used to doing that. So that's limiting. So how the theater's formed is that the acoustics, the soft seating, the carbonated sugar water, and the complex carbohydrated, popcorn, they're all there to pacify all your other senses aren't working. The darkness is to say there's nothing important here. Plus, they put you in a big box full of strangers that heighten the emotional aspect. So that theater design that has evolved over 100 years is as important as the movie to get you to that world. And so when you say, let's make a choice, you wake up that part of your mind that is already pacified, and then you don't give them anything to do. So yeah, that's going to come out false. Is you wake them up to do something that means nothing to increasing the experience or transporting the imagination. However, in our interaction, if you have to force them, you're not doing it right in theater.
What's your opinion on the impact of virtual presence, like 360 photography and videos? I mean, the virtual presence where you're able to teleport someone virtually to another location so that they can experience something that they would otherwise be able to.
Right. I think that every aspect of this is important. So 360 video is very important in certain contexts. So when I'm doing something on a tabletop and I need to have a context, because that context is as important as the subject, I can take you there, but that's being perceived in the perceptual aspects, not the focal, and that adds to the area. So it's a matter of, this is a palette of realities, and a palette of senses, and a palette of engagement. Do I want to be passive? Do I want to be active, reactive, interactive, experiential? Those are all palettes that I work with. And also, the aspect of like outer space, if I need to bring another person to where I am, so it's not just me going out there, it's them coming to me. All of them have an important tool on your palette, and as you're an experiential architect, you use the right tool at the right place, at the right element, with the right picture. So all of them are really critically important.
I'm thinking about, when they finally start adding, augmented reality interaction into, VR environment or 360 video environments.
Yeah, they're competing elements. So, what do I lose? What do I gain? In an interactive film, I lose a lot by bringing interactivity. I go into another space, if I don't have it, and so it's a matter of looking at that total experience behind the eyeballs. The magic's behind the eyeballs, and understand, is that moving me forward? Is it getting to my objectives? And that's really what we're looking at, is depending on what our objective is, what do we use, when, why, and how, is where we'll construct, and then we'll take you there, and get that. And so the answer varies. They're all important. It's a matter of making sure that you put the right thing in the right space and don't make it an obstacle to get there. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.